Welcome! In today's explainer, we're stepping totally out of the ordinary and plunging headfirst into a beautifully surreal, wildly inventive landscape. We're focusing our lens on the celebrated contemporary American author Karen Russell. You know, in an era where modern life can honestly feel pretty absurd and overwhelming sometimes, Russell's brand of storytelling feels more vital than ever. Get ready, because we are about to unpack a literary world where the boundary between everyday life and absolute fantasy just completely dissolves. By blending the completely mundane with the utterly magical, her writing actually manages to reveal some surprisingly deep, resonant truths about who we really are.
So what do wolves, ghosts, and Florida swamps have in common? I know, it sounds like the setup to a really bizarre joke, right? But if you try to find a logical, literal connection, well, you're going to end up a bit lost. Lean into that mystery for a second, because the answer isn't a punchline at all. These are actually the fundamental building blocks of Karen Russell's fiction. Her stories are famous for taking things that honestly just should not exist together and forcing them into the exact same room. Let's take a rapid-fire look at the specific, strange elements you'll typically bump into when you open one of her books.
First up, wolf girls. Yeah, we're talking about literal children raised by wolves, desperately trying to navigate the complexities of human society. Imagine being a teenager whose biggest problem isn't just passing a pop quiz, but, suppressing the deep, instinctual urge to mark your territory or chase a squirrel out the window. Take her famous character Claudette, for example. She literally has to unlearn how to howl at the moon just to figure out how to fold her socks and wear penny loafers. It's wildly imaginative, and it instantly sets this strange, untamed surface for her storytelling.
Then, you've got ghostly presences. But in Russell's work, these definitely aren't your typical horror movie jump scares, and they aren't haunting creepy old Victorian mansions either. These supernatural occurrences just casually coexist right alongside humans. Take her Pulitzer-nominated novel Swamplandia, where a teenage girl named Osceola literally falls in love with the ghost of a young man who died way back in the 1930s. It's not treated as a terrifying haunting. Actually, it's treated as a quirky, albeit deeply tragic, adolescent romance. The impossible just seems completely ordinary, woven right into the fabric of everyday life.
And finally, we have bizarre institutions. Her characters frequently find themselves trapped in incredibly unsettling, strange organizations. Whether it's a sleep donation camp where insomnia has become a deadly national plague, or an early 19th century factory where girls are literally transforming into silkworms to spin thread, Russell masterfully takes the impossible and drops it right into reality. These institutions function perfectly on their own absurd logic, trapping the characters in systems that are so much bigger than themselves.
Okay, so let's ground ourselves with a few facts about the mind behind all this madness. Who exactly is Karen Russell? Well, she's a contemporary American author, born and raised in Miami, Florida, and that specific location, as we'll see in a minute, heavily colors her entire worldview. She went on to earn her MFA from Columbia University, which is where she really sharpened her incredible talent for blending gritty realism with high fantasy. She gained massive national recognition with her short story collection, St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves, and she absolutely didn't stop there. She later published the novel Swamplandia, which became a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Today, she's widely studied in literature courses across the country, firmly established as a real game changer and one of the most celebrated voices in 21st century fiction.
Section 1. Defining the magic, how the impossible becomes real. Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly does Russell pull off this crazy balancing act of the bizarre and the believable?
The core mechanism she uses to build her worlds is called magical realism. Magical realism is a literary genre where extraordinary, fantastical events appear within an otherwise realistic world, and characters just accept these unusual events as completely normal. To really grasp this, you kind of have to separate it from high fantasy. In a world like Lord of the Rings, the entire universe is magical, right? There are wizards, elves, and entirely different rules of physics. But in magical realism, the world looks exactly like ours. There are minivans, homework assignments, and overdue bills. But right next to the minivan, there might be a living gargoyle. In Russell's stories, a fantastical creature isn't a world-breaking event. It's literally just Tuesday. But here's the real secret. The fantasy elements are rarely included just for pure entertainment. They're a vehicle. She uses the fantastic to explore incredibly deep emotional truths about family, fear, and identity.
A massive part of how she grounds this magical realism is through her vivid, deeply atmospheric settings. Like we mentioned, Russell grew up in South Florida, and that landscape heavily influences her writing. We're talking lush Florida swamps and wetlands, isolated communities, decaying landscapes, and strange, dreamlike institutions. If you've ever been to the Everglades, you know it almost feels like another planet. The oppressive humidity, the way nature is constantly threatening to just swallow up human civilization whole, it's inherently a little magical. For Russell, the setting is never simply a painted backdrop. It's an active force. A decaying tourist trap or a murky swamp often perfectly mirrors the complicated, shifting emotional experiences of her characters. Reality and fantasy just overlap seamlessly in the thick heat of those Florida wetlands.
Section 2. Case Study. St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves. Let's shift our focus from the surface-level weirdness of this story to the actual mechanics of her metaphor.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what makes her writing so incredibly powerful. On one hand, we have the strange situation. Girls raised by wolves attending a human boarding school to learn human behavior. It's an impossible, completely surreal premise. But compare that with the familiar emotion on the other side: cultural assimilation, identity loss, and growing up. As the wolf girls stumble around in their unfamiliar human clothing or desperately struggle to master the complexities of human language, readers quickly realize that the story actually isn't about wolves at all. It's about the painfully authentic, relatable human challenge of being forced into a new culture. It perfectly mirrors the immigrant experience, or honestly, even just the isolating, awkward alienation of going through puberty and becoming someone totally new while trying desperately not to lose who you originally were.
Let's break this down a bit more, because Russell uses physical elements to represent massive internal and social struggles. Think of it like a hidden language. Look at the animals in her work. They almost always represent pure instinct, a character's core identity, true freedom, and the painful process of transformation. Meanwhile, the wilderness, the dark woods or those murky swamps we talked about, that embodies untamed emotions and independence, but also danger and pure possibility. And when those raw natural forces clash with human institutions, like schools, camps, or theme parks, well, that's where we see the real conflict. Those institutions are almost always symbols for social pressure and conformity. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that when a character is forced from the wilderness into an institution, we aren't just reading a fun fantasy story, we are watching a profound, high-stakes struggle over whether a person will successfully adapt to social pressures or fiercely resist them to keep their soul intact.
Section 3. The emotional core. Outsiders and identity. Okay, this brings us to the absolute deepest layer of the onion.
Beneath the dark humor, the lyrical prose, and the sheer weirdness, her stories are fundamentally focused on adolescents, young adults, and social outsiders experiencing major life transitions. So let's look at the raw emotional questions her protagonists constantly grapple with. The first one? Who am I? This is the beating emotional core of her characters. Think back to those wolf girls for a second. How do you answer, who am I, when you're neither fully wolf nor fully human? When you are caught right between two worlds, whether that's between the untamed wilderness and rigid civilization, or simply the super awkward gap between childhood and adulthood, your sense of self is fractured. You aren't the child you used to be, but you aren't exactly the adult you're supposed to become either. Her characters are always desperately trying to piece that identity back together.
Next, they ask, where do I belong? This is that deep, universal human struggle with inclusion and exclusion. Consider Ava Bigtree from Swamplandia, literally paddling through an incredibly dangerous alligator-infested swamp to try and save her broken family. She is searching for safety in a world that has completely fallen apart around her. When the landscape around you is constantly shifting like that, finding a safe harbor, finding your people, becomes an urgent matter of emotional and sometimes actual physical survival.
All of this builds to perhaps the ultimate struggle in her work. How do I change without losing myself? This question is perfectly mirrored by her characters, who are forced to adapt to strange institutions or entirely new cultures. It's the deep-seated anxiety of assimilation. To fit in with the humans, the wolf girls have to let their wolf traits die. It begs the question, how much of the wolf, how much of your wild, authentic self do you literally have to kill just to survive in the human world of rules and expectations?
And finally, what does it mean to become an adult? When you strip away the swamps, the ghosts, and all the magic, Karen Russell's entire body of work is a profound, inventive, and deeply moving exploration of coming of age, survival, and a very specific type of melancholy. It's the grief of leaving your past behind. The true tragedy in her stories isn't just that the characters change, it's that they realize they can never, ever go back. Once you learn the rules of the adult world, the wild, carefree state of childhood is gone forever.
Karen Russell's fiction demonstrates that literature can be wildly imaginative while still carrying immense emotional weight. By combining fantasy, humor, and symbolism, she challenges us to think about belonging and transformation in completely new ways. As this quote captures perfectly, sometimes the strangest stories reveal the most important truths about what it means to be human.
So I leave you to ponder, what untamed wilderness are you currently navigating in your own life, and what truths might you find if you just look at it through a slightly stranger lens? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer of Karen Russell's brilliant work, and keep exploring.